Societal Reform Part 2. So this is a continuation of the last video. So we also are going to have feminists during this time period. Really quick note, I always like to define this for students. Feminism is equality between the genders, whereas misogyny is men are better than women, and misandry is women are better than men. So we get progressives during this time period calling for full female equality, and they're going to start calling themselves feminists. One of these feminists is going to be pictured here, Margaret Sanger. She's actually going to establish the modern birth control movement. The thing is, this would infuriate a lot of people who saw birth control as like a threat to family morality and just family in general. And so she actually had to flee to Europe for a time, but others take up the cause, and she actually does eventually come back, and she's cleared of all charges. Unfortunately, it's partly because her daughter, who was 5 years old at the time, died quite suddenly. But others take up the cause, and they're going to form things like the National Birth Control League in 1915. It doesn't have a lot of immediate success, but it will cause triumph for later generations, because it turns out when women can control when they have babies, it gives them a lot more bargaining power in society in general. We also have to look at immigrants really quick. This is kind of stepping out of the reforms for just a moment. A lot of progressives during this time period wanted to limit immigration into the United States specifically for racist reasons and nativist reasons, whether this be like the Japanese or Chinese out in like California, or Mexicans out west and south as well. Or even like nationally wanting to just keep people from Southern and Eastern Europe out of the United States. The thing is, a lot of people felt like immigration held down wages and impeded unionization. And then others disliked immigrants on like religious grounds or cultural grounds or ethnic grounds. Remember all the nativist stuff that we've already been looking into. Even when you get into groups like the social gospelers, who were very much about morality and everything, they still wanted to have like English classes and campaigns that really tried to Americanize immigrants as fast as possible. The issue with immigrants is going to really tie into prohibition, though. The thing is, when we're looking at prohibition, which is the movement against alcohol, prohibiting alcohol basically, so they're wanting to prohibit alcohol, social workers really saw alcohol as the cause of so many issues in society. They saw alcohol as causing crime, as causing poverty, as causing family violence. Employers were for prohibition because they saw alcohol as causing like industrial accidents and inefficiency in the workplace. The social gospelers tend to see alcohol as like impairing moral judgment and behavior, and they're all about morality and everything. The problem was a lot of immigrants during this time period saw liquor and the neighborhood saloon as basically a vital part to their day-to-day life. Alcoholism is defined very differently in most of Europe than America today. And it's also defined differently in a lot of different nations around the world. And so newly arrived immigrants aren't going to view alcohol as much of a problem as many Americans did at this time. So prohibition actually really becomes a focus of a lot of nativist hostility. Prohibitionists are going to campaign for all kinds of laws at the local level and at the state level. They wanted to set up laws against the manufacturing and sale of alcohol, and they're going to be really successful really across the United States. And then their biggest success is actually the 18th Amendment, which made prohibition the law of the land in 1920. So for a time period, alcohol consumption was illegal in the United States. Of course, there were some exceptions to that, but I'm not going to get into that. We also have to look at a lot of progressives weren't just nativist. A lot of them were also racist. A lot of progressives believed that racial control was basically necessary for social order. And so we see racism during this time period is going to gain popular support. But race relations are going to deteriorate across the nation, even in the North. That being said, we also get Black progressives, and so we get Black activism growing during this time period. A lot of Black women would oftentimes work towards settlement houses of their own, kindergartens, daycare centers. They had limited successes in challenging the education system, trying to get help for Black people. But the fact that there were Black progressives pushing for these kinds of reforms for Black schools shows just a huge commitment to reform society across racial lines. We're also going to see a lot of African Americans during this time period, especially in the North, would start rejecting the whole Atlanta Compromise and Booker T. Washington's philosophy of accommodation. And instead, we're seeing groups meet together and activists come together at the Niagara Falls Convention in Canada in 1905. And here they would join in with white reformers to organize the NAACP, or the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. They're going to establish this in 1910, and by 1918, they have 44,000 members. So this is not a small group. And 2 generations later, they're going to successfully challenge racial discrimination in the United States. This is just a primary source really quick that is by the National Negro Committee in 1909. So you can see here Black people, denouncing racism and everything. They say, "We denounce the ever-growing oppression of our 10 million colored fellow citizens as the greatest menace that threatens the country. Often plundered of their just share of public funds, robbed of nearly all part in the government, segregated by common carriers, some murdered with impunity, and all treated with open contempt by officials. They are held in some states in practical slavery to the white community. The systematic persecution of the law-abiding citizens and their disenfranchisement on account of their race alone is a crime that will ultimately drag down to an infamous end any nation that allows it to be practiced. And it bears most heavily on those poor white farmers and laborers whose economic position is most similar to that of the persecuted race."